Hey, this is Kathleen. Before we get started, the Living Planet team has some exciting news. Starting in September, we'll be devoting a regular episode to answering your questions. Questions you have about the environment and climate change, questions about an episode you've heard, or even questions about us. You can write to us in the comment section on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. Or you can send us a good old-fashioned email at livingplanet@dw.com. That's living as in not dead, and planet as in the place we all live at dw.com. Thanks, and we can't wait to hear from you. Now, let's start the show.
In a dimly lit club in Kyoto, Japan, the sound of the tonkori, a five-stringed instrument once silenced by cultural assimilation, cuts through the air. On stage is Oki Kano, a 68-year-old musician who spent decades reviving the music and spirit of Japan's indigenous Ainu people.
It's like salmon knows where they were born, always back to the same river. So I was one of the salmon. That's why I returned to my Ainu background.
Oki's music blends rock, dub, and traditional Ainu folk, a sound that's both a celebration and a protest. He doesn't call himself an activist, but his work speaks volumes about identity, survival, and resistance.
My father was Ainu, you know. And my parents divorced when I was 4 years old. And my mother hid my Ainu background, you know. Then I found out that I was in a 20-something, you know.
Stories like Oki's aren't unique. For generations, Ainu families were forced to hide who they were. After Japan annexed their homeland, the northern island of Hokkaido in the late 19th century, the government banned traditional hunting, fishing, and the language. Many Ainu were pushed into poverty and silence. Today, the exact number of Ainu in Japan is hard to pin down. A 2017 government survey identified around 13,000 in Hokkaido, but advocacy groups believe the true figure could be 10 times higher.
The time of my grandfather, they decided not telling Ainu language to the kids, my father's generation, for survive. Ainu needed to acting like a ordinary Japanese. That was the best way to survive in Japan. That's why my grandfathers and grandmothers decided not telling Ainu culture to next generation.
Today, Oki is one of the most well-known Ainu musicians in the world. He's helped bring Ainu culture back into public view, even as the legacy of colonization continues to cast a long shadow. And now, he's worried about a new and toxic threat to his homeland.
Nuclear thing, this is totally against the Ainu philosophy.
The threat of his homeland being used as a permanent storage site for nuclear waste. This week's episode of Living Planet brings you a story about energy, identity, and the cost of progress. It's about who gets to decide what happens to the land and who gets left out of that decision. I'm Neil King. March 2011. a massive earthquake strikes off Japan's northeastern coast. The tsunami that follows devastates entire towns and triggers one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. At the Fukushima nuclear plant, the tsunami wrecks the power supply and cooling systems. 3 reactors melt down. Radiation leaks into the air, the soil, the sea.
Wide areas remain in ruins after the record 8.9 magnitude quake and the tsunami that followed. Nearly 700 people are confirmed dead so far.
Following the disaster, all of Japan's nuclear reactors are shut down. And the shock ripples far beyond Japan.
Germany's coalition government has agreed to shut all its nuclear plants in response to Japan's...
Germany and Switzerland announce nuclear phase-outs. Anti-nuclear sentiment surges across the globe. But more than a decade later, the tide is turning again.
In a major policy shift, Japan is looking to nuclear power to tackle soaring energy costs.
Japan, like many countries, is under pressure to decarbonize, and fast. With few natural resources of its own and the spectre of energy insecurity and inflation, the Japanese public appears to be warming to nuclear energy again. Since 2015, it has gradually ramped up nuclear power to about 8.5%. And the Japanese government is planning to get 20% of its electricity from nuclear by 2040. But there's still a problem no one has solved. What to do with the waste?
The amount of high-level waste generated by nuclear reactors is exceptionally small.
That's nuclear scientist Jacopo Bongiorno from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT.
That's because the energy density of uranium is exceptionally high. Just to give you a comparison, compared to, say, burning coal or natural gas, a kilogram for a kilogram, if you are using uranium as your fuel, you get about 10 to 20 million times, not just 10 to 20, but 10 to 20 million times more energy out of the same material. If an individual like myself or you would use only nuclear energy for all their energy needs throughout the lifetime, so not today, not a month, not a year, but our lifetime, say 80 years, then the amount of nuclear waste generated would fit within a coffee cup. And therefore, the amount of waste that you generate is exceedingly low. The bad news is that it's highly radioactive and it has to be sort of handled with care.
And that waste he's referring to, which essentially is the spent fuel rods, stays dangerous for tens of thousands of years. And it has to be stored somewhere, ideally underground. In 2020, 2 tiny fishing villages in Hokkaido, Susu and Komonai, volunteered to be studied as potential sites for Japan's first permanent nuclear waste repository. In exchange, they received millions in government subsidies. But there's a catch. These villages sit on traditional Ainu land. And even if no known Ainus live here nowadays,
the whole idea of having nuclear power anywhere in ancestral Ainu territory is always going to be an Ainu problem.
Anne-Elise Llewellyn is an American scholar who spent years researching Ainu rights. She describes what's happening to the Ainu as energy colonialism. That's when indigenous lands are used for energy projects without consent.
So energy colonialism, I understand it as a particular kind of settler colonialism that is targeting some type of resource. That might be coal, gas, oil, uranium, rare earths, lithium is a big problem now, but any kind of resource, oftentimes buried under the ground. In the case of nuclear, it involves removing the uranium or some other kind of raw material that will be made into nuclear fuel on one end of the nuclear fuel cycle. And then on the other end, you are hollowing out the land and using that emptied out land as a permanent wasting ground.
In 2011, just months after Fukushima, Oki Kano stood before the United Nations in Geneva. He warned that nuclear energy was not just a safety issue, it was a justice issue.
And he really raised his voice in a very powerful, very critical way, asked the question about where did this uranium come from and how is nuclear a problem for indigenous peoples, that I think forced a lot of people who hadn't been thinking about it from that perspective to begin asking questions. And I was one of those who was very inspired by his words.
Sutsu and Kamonai are two quiet fishing villages on the western coast of Hokkaido. Combined, they're home to just over 3,600 people. Nearly half are over the age of 60. These towns have seen better days. The fishing industry is shrinking. Young people are moving away. So when the Japanese government offered billions of yen in subsidies to communities willing to be studied as potential nuclear waste sites, they said yes. The money has helped repair piers, build nursing homes and fund local infrastructure. For some, it's a lifeline. For others, it's a gamble with the future. The Ainu weren't part of that decision. Not when the villagers volunteered, not when the studies began. Not even when the government's own agency, NUMO, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, came to town. Since then, NUMO have said they'd be happy to address any concerns. But critics say that's too little, too late.
My criticism of that is that, on the one hand, as a nation state, it seems morally problematic to say we support the UNDRIP, and then on the other hand saying, however, Ainu do not have the right to be part of any public discussion, even to join a public comment period, and to weigh in on this question around whether or not Hokkaido should host nuclear waste forever, basically.
Japan signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, in 2007. It explicitly states that hazardous materials should not be stored or disposed of on the lands or territories of indigenous peoples without their free, prior and informed consent. Even if the declaration is not legally binding, it is a moral commitment. But in Hokkaido, that principle appears to have been ignored. The decision to move forward now rests with the village mayors and the governor of Hokkaido. The governor has voiced opposition, citing a 2000 ordinance that bans nuclear waste from the island. But under current law, the first phase of study can proceed without his approval. Deep beneath the surface of Hokkaido, Japan has been testing what it would take to store nuclear waste underground, permanently. The site is called Holonobe. It's an experimental facility meant to simulate what a real repository might look like. The facility includes shafts and tunnels that go down to 350 meters, allowing research into hydrogeology and rock stability, as well as radionuclide behavior in sedimentary formations. But there's a problem. Water.
I think it was around 300 cubic meters of water per day were coming into their facility. That's underground water.
Sean Burney is a nuclear specialist with Greenpeace East Asia. He's worked in Japan and South Korea for over a decade, and he says water is a deal breaker.
Water is a transport mechanism for radiological materials. So if you can't isolate your facility from water, the containers that the waste is put into, of course, that will corrode over potentially hundreds of years, certainly thousands of years. There will be no containment as such. And therefore, the radionuclides will migrate through the water system, water course. So Hokkaido is completely unsuitable as a geological repository.
Japan is one of the most seismically active countries in the world. Earthquakes, groundwater, and long-term corrosion. These are no small risks when you're talking about waste that stays radioactive for tens of thousands of years. But not everyone agrees. At MIT, nuclear scientist Jacopo Bongiorno sees things differently.
The radioactivity contained within these fuel rods is not particularly mobile. It doesn't really want to go anywhere. So don't think about, now I've created this radioactive waste and all of a sudden it's going to spew into the atmosphere and it's going to go all over the place. It doesn't want to do that because it's 99%, it's actually in solid form within the fuel pellets, within these fuel rods, and it stays there. Okay. So it's also very easy to shield.
He says the waste is stored in solid ceramic pellets, encased in steel and concrete. First, it cools in water pools for several years. Then it's sealed in dry canisters that can last a century or more.
In fact, in all the environmental impact assessments, or assessment studies done for these repositories, you have to assume that at one point your containers are completely rusted away. Okay, so at one point you assume that there is complete failure, and so now you got these radionuclides. They are, maybe a couple of 100 meters underground, and then the question becomes, how do they diffuse underground? And so the bulk of the analysis and assessment that go into the licensing of the repository is exactly how are the radionuclides, once they are outside these canisters or these containers, how are they going to diffuse underground? And that's why the selection of the proper geology is very important.
The science, he says, is sound if the geology is right. But that's exactly what critics like Bernie are questioning in Hokkaido.
So just saying we're designing a geological repository to last 100,000 years, actually the materials in there will be hazardous for millions and millions of years. It removes the problem from this generation for someone in the future to deal with the problem when it starts affecting them.
And that raises a deeper question. Even if we can store nuclear waste safely, should we? Especially if the people most affected, like the Ainu, never agree to it. Japan's nuclear future is still uncertain. The government wants nuclear to make up 20% of the country's energy mix by 2040. But experts disagree on whether that's realistic or even wise.
I've done a lot of analysis over the years on the breakdown of their nuclear sector and how much each reactor would generate electricity-wise in terawatt hours. If they get the best case scenario, what can they get to? So my best guess is that they could possibly reach around 15% of national electricity from nuclear energy by 2030. And that assumes that there's not problems with the reactors. And they still have huge problems, seismic problems, design problems, security problems, safety problems.
Bernie believes Japan is clinging to a fading dream. He says nuclear energy diverts resources from renewables and risks locking the country into fossil fuels when nuclear falls short.
The biggest problem I see with maintaining nuclear is that they will fail on the nuclear target. That's where there's a very close relationship between the nuclear industry and the fossil fuel industry. So the fossil plants will basically be retained. Of course, there are some new gas plants in Japan, of course. But when the gap becomes clear, it will be filled most likely by fossil fuel plants. So Japan will undermine its own decarbonization progress by maintaining a nuclear share. They need to signal that they can go fully 100% renewables, which they can.
But MIT's Jacopo Bongiorno sees nuclear as essential, not just for Japan, but for the world.
If you're trying to decarbonize your grid exclusively with intermittent renewables, such as solar and wind, the average cost, the aggregate cost of your grid goes up dramatically. Yes, it is true that a solar panel or a wind turbine have become cheaper. But if you don't have a reliable base load source like nuclear, and you're trying to meet your electricity demand 24/7, 365 days per year, no matter what the weather is, no matter what the load is, etc., then in order to meet that demand, you need to overbuild and overgrow the amount of solar and wind, and importantly, energy storage, batteries, that goes with it to meet that demand. And the aggregate cost of all that equipment far exceeds the cost of having also a nuclear baseload in the mix. It's really the combination of nuclear and renewables that gives you the least cost decarbonized system.
Two visions. One sees nuclear as a bridge to a cleaner future. The other sees it as a costly detour, one that risks repeating old mistakes. But all the experts interviewed for this episode agreed on one thing: communication matters.
You can't simply say it's safe, therefore accept it. You gotta engage them from the beginning, try to explain what the risks are, what the benefits are, what the value of nuclear is. Otherwise, it's not gonna happen.
What I think is really important is that space be made and opportunities be created to have sort of a broader set of regional or even Japan-wide public forums where you can bring in different constituencies to speak to these very, very hard questions about the future of the land and really the future of the ocean.
Back in Kyoto, Oki Kano finishes his set. The crowd cheers, but his message lingers. A quiet reminder that this isn't just about energy policy. It's about respect and balance.
Balance on people's activity, human activity, and the nature balance. You know, I think this is not only the Ainu issue. Everybody's issue. Yeah. We get together and face up to the problem and do some activity. You know, that we need.
This week's episode was produced by Charmaine Lee, with support from the Pulitzer Center and translator Xiao Yang. It was edited and soundscaped by me, Neil King. Our sound engineer was Jan Winkelmann. Any questions or feedback, just drop us a line, or even better, a voice message to livingplanet@dw.com. And while you're online, why not check out our YouTube channel at DW Podcasts for bonus content. Thanks for listening and sharing Living Planet.